There's often a debate and some consternation here about Pope Francis. He's never been to the United States. That's a big issue. Many say he doesn't know or understand the United States. When he says some of these very memorable or head-shaking kind of things, comments about capitalism or culture, he doesn't really know what he's talking about in terms of the U.S. context. What is his experience of the United States? What does he know?
Yeah, I mean, I think anxiety which starts from the fact that Francis doesn't know the United States is well-founded. He doesn't know the United States. I was asked, in fact, by Cardinal Dolan last year, in all the writings and the homilies that I'd read of Francis's, had the US ever come up? And I couldn't actually think of a single instance in which it had. Not entirely surprising, given that he almost never left Buenos Aires, only ever left Buenos Aires to go to Rome for meetings. So I suppose one could say that he doesn't know much about the United States. He doesn't know much about most of the world. In fact, when he was in the Sistine Chapel in the conclave in 2005, that was the first time he'd ever been in the Sistine Chapel. Yeah? So not a well-traveled man, but an extremely well-informed man. And I think you need have no doubt, and I know anyway because of people who have been involved in the preparation of this trip, that he's boning up, that he's talking to an enormous number of people. He's obviously had very intense talks with the bishops, as always in preparation for a trip, but he's been speaking to a lot of people here who he knows, who he trusts, and whose judgment he trusts. So I think he'll be very, very well informed. I think also you'll find that he'll come wanting to learn. He's a great man of dialogue. I think the point where he's going to be vulnerable to criticism is already the one that's appeared, is that when he has spoken about capitalism, the assumption is that he's coming from a background of a dysfunctional capitalism, which is the Argentine capitalism, which is, I mean, it's a extremely poorly managed economy, which has suffered, of course, from corporatism and statism, Peronist massive overspending, corruption, and so on. And that is his model of capitalism. And of course, he was deeply scarred by, as was the whole of Argentina, by the economic collapse of 2001, when Argentina defaulted on its debt and entered it into the most profound economic crisis. So one might say that his experience of global capitalism has been shaped by that, and that's a legitimate criticism. And there are, of course, people here who say what the Pope needs to know is that we actually need more US-style market capitalism, not less. But I think that the US also needs to listen to a man who brings with him the perspective of the poor of the world. Precisely because we live in a global economy, the US economy does deeply impact our economies too, because the European economies and the North American economies enormously influence the way people live in Brazil and the Philippines and Argentina. So he will bring that perspective of the poorest, and he will say that an economic system which tolerates a large number of unemployed, which generates consumption, but at the same time damages the planet, needs to be challenged, needs to be critiqued, and he won't flinch from that. Just on Cuba, it's fascinating, hasn't it? This itinerary has just been announced. He will actually be spending, I think, almost as much time in Cuba as he will in the United States. He's going to 4 places in Cuba, and he's going to 3 here. So in many ways, it's curious, isn't it, that the Cuba trip is turning into, or I think has turned into the antechamber, what's the word I'm looking for? Really, this is a trip, right? A 2-country trip. And that I think we need to look out for the way that the Cuba visit shapes the US visit. He's going to be giving messages from Cuba that are also aimed at the United States as well as Cuba. Cuba, by the way, is fascinating. Francis has always been concerned with Cuba, at least for many, many years. And he had a conversation on the day of his election with the Cardinal Archbishop of Havana, which went roughly like this. Archbishop of Havana, Jaime Ortega, says, "Jorge, this afternoon you're going to be elected Pope." And Bergoglio says, "Yes, if the omelette doesn't get flipped, I guess I will be." And Ortega says, "Well, I'd like to talk to you about Latin America." So they go back to the Santa Marta and spend 40 minutes before lunch discussing how Latin American politics has been paralyzed by the polarization, the standoff between the US and Cuba. This has been a constant subject of discussion for them. So for the church to oversee a transition in Cuba to a democratic, pluralistic government based on nationalist traditions, Cuba's own national Christian traditions, rather than following the US model and obviously not following the Soviet or communist model, but to forge an independent, democratic, nationalist future for Cuba, unlocks the future not just for Cuba, but for the whole of Latin America. And I would be paying very, very close attention to that trip.
And to see whether Raul Castro makes good on his threat to return to the Catholic Church.
We expect to see Raul Castro praying and in church.
With Al Gore, apparently. You all heard that. Al Gore said he was considering becoming Catholic. I think he was a little tongue-in-cheek, but, that would be a greater miracle than me becoming Catholic.
Perhaps they could be received into the church at the same time.
Exactly, yes, yeah, it would make sense. John, do you have any about the Pope and how much he understands the U.S.?
Yeah, I share what Austen's perspective on this, and Austen knows better than I. This Pope really is almost a stranger to U.S. culture, or appears to be. But I think, there are a lot of worries that precede every papal trip to places like the U.S. People are predicting, oh my God, he won't understand what we're all about, or he's going to come to criticize us, or it's going to be very tense. Oftentimes, these predictions give way to a graciousness, a dialogue, and an impact that goes on. And I think that's what's going to happen here. I agree that what makes this trip doubly interesting is that it's preceded by Cuba. I mean, he's going to have a chance to really address the economic issues from a global perspective, and that's just going to be fascinating. I do think, too, that one area following his encyclical on ecology, that I'm sure that the Pope will be talking about this as a bridge issue to people who perhaps are not in the church in this country, who have drifted away. I just want to read one quote. "The earth itself groans under the weight of consumerist greed and irresponsible exploitation. Ecology is part of an ethic of respect for creation and the Creator." That actually was pronounced by Pope Benedict in the United States in 2008. So, there is a certain continuity here, and what Pope Francis says in that respect probably is not going to be breaking all that much new ground.
One interesting thing I think that will happen in the ecology encyclical is that he will bring together two discourses, if you like, which have normally been seen as coming from opposite sides of the spectrum. I think he's going to link ecology, the care for the natural world, the quote really that John's just given us. He's going to give that message, but at the same time a message about what Benedict called human ecology. In other words, if we respect the divine grammar in creation, we also need to respect the divine grammar of human relationships, marriage, family, and so on. So the phrase to look out for is integral ecology. And I think he's going to be bringing together, if you like, a left-wing and a right-wing discourse into one. And I think he's going to be saying to progressive people, look, if you care about the environment, you need also to care about the ecology of human relationships. You need to care about this so-called right-wing issue. And he's going to be saying to the family values people, look, if you care about human relationships and marriage and family, you need also to care about the environment. And I think he's going to bring together those two in a very new way. I'm looking out for that.
It's also, there's so many narratives that get set before these trips, as John was saying. And I think one of the narratives, and then it flips a little bit, one of the narratives with Benedict was, here's this kind of stiff German theologian coming here, and then it surprises people. I also wonder if there's such a narrative of expectation and anticipation for Francis, that again, when he comes out and he says, the grammar of creation is a man and a woman and marriage, traditional marriage and things, all of a sudden, this stuff will come crumbling down, and when all the headlines say what everybody who's kind of followed him already knows. So that will be interesting.
Pope Catholic, after all, will be the New York Times headline.
Pope Catholic, yeah, exactly. I love that New York Post story you mentioned about being able to forgive abortion, something new. Let's open it up to questions, if we can. Sure.
What Vatican media, because now the the worst situation, I think, in the world, Vatican media, American media, we advertise and proliferate postmodernistic philosophy. This means that nothing is good, nothing is bad, and we have very boring results because we're losing not only in media and just French, even our friends around the world don't want us support, because if we not, I think all religions are based on commandment types: don't kill, don't steal. Just, I am talking about normal people, not very radical or something extremist, which are, and what you do in this, like in past, US, Vatican were very strong because we had a radio station like Voice of America, Free Europe, and results were very fantastic, because the most bloody system, communist system, was destroyed thanks to them. And what we're doing now, we trying to say that everything is relativistic. Relativistic is only in physics, not in base of West. The success of West and different part of world is that they obey some commandment, as I said, because all religion agree with this. And there's nothing wrong. Don't kill, don't steal, okay? Maybe answer starting from Mr. Nostradamus to Dr. Austen, okay?
If I could just say real quickly, I think, if I understand you, I think a lot of this goes to also the revolution in media, which is also one of the novelties that's happened in these last few years in terms of covering papal trips. Media is relativistic, I think, by its nature, but more so now than ever when you get Twitter and Facebook and coverage from everywhere. But on the other hand, it's also a great tool. It is only a tool, and the Vatican is right now trying to rework its tools because a lot of the things that worked in the past in terms of having just official channels that everyone would read don't work so much anymore. So I think that is a problem. It's something the church has to face, but it's also can be a positive in the sense that all of us here can cover a papal visit in ways that we never could before.
Yeah, we had Pope Benedict, who for 8 years took aim at the dictatorship of relativism, and I think he said pretty much all there was to say about it. I don't see this Pope making that his primary target, and I'll pass this to Austen, but has Pope Francis really spoken in those terms?
Yes, I don't think that, no, that is not his primary concern, no.
Right.
I have one. Hi, guys. So, media people here, so I'm going to throw out Marshall McLuhan for a second. He spoke about a light bulb creating an environment by its mere presence. And how are we reporting and telling our stories today? And how do you see that shaping the narrative of the papacy of Pope Francis?
Could you just repeat it real quickly?
I actually wrote it down because I was thinking of this while you guys were talking, but Marshall McLuhan spoke about a light bulb creating an environment by its mere presence. And how are we reporting, telling our stories today, and how do you see that really shaping the narrative of the papacy? For instance, we have Twitter. That's a way a lot of people are getting news out. And I just kind of wanted to think about the ways that we're telling our stories, the way that we're sharing our news. How is it changing really, and how is it shaping the narrative?
Well, I'm going to defer to these two real reporters here on my left, because I'm not a real reporter. But I would just say that what's fascinating to me about the way news works now is that the line between, and this is quite often commented on, the line between the story and the commentary is increasingly blurred. And it's really hard to tell where one begins and one ends. And so a story gets taken up into the the Twitter sphere, the commentariat, and it develops and it takes on a life of its own. It gets commented on, it gets contradicted, then gets commented on again. And so I think actually the role of reporting, what these guys on my left do, is so important, because actually one needs to keep coming back to realities, what the Pope actually said, the truth, the background, and so on, because otherwise things can very quickly become unreal. So I would say that the dynamic of the story, well, the stories have become much more dynamic because they get commented on much more, but the danger is then that the reality on which they're commentating quickly becomes divorced from the commentary.
Yeah, that's true, and I think we all recognize we live in this giant echo chamber right now, which has, been made more echoey by social media. And original reporting is very key when you're trying to understand somebody like Pope Francis, because the man does so much, number one. Even in the space of a single day, he does so much. Little bits and pieces can be picked out and end up on Twitter without telling you the real story. And so, while I think it's great that social media has brought this Pope and what's happening at the Vatican to millions and millions or billions of more people than it otherwise might have reached, I often wonder about, our habits of news consumption, especially when it's through these kind of quick bite, sound bite, or Twitter feed forms. I don't think we can truly understand this Pope in 140 characters. And obviously, thank God, we have people like Austen, who's written a masterful a book on understanding the Pope. But as we go forward, every single thing he does is going to be subject again to the preconceptions that people bring. And I spoke about this earlier. I think a dominant way the media treats the Pope is by looking for this conflict. And I don't think that's the way the Pope is approaching his role. So that's something to keep in mind again when he arrives here. I do think, as I said before, that once a Pope gets to a country, suddenly the impact can be much broader and much deeper, mainly because, you have wall-to-wall coverage. Oftentimes he'll be given an hour on live television for the first time. And for many people, when the Pope arrives and they're actually seeing him firsthand and at longer than soundbite periods of time and expression, that's when they get to know him.
I'd also just throw in that, John had mentioned the difficulty of covering papal trips. Being on the plane sounds great, and it is often, but it can also be a golden cage. Being in the press center can be a better way to cover it. But doing the Francis thing and going on the peripheries, being there with the crowds who are listening at the edge of a large gathering someplace, can also be another way to cover it in a completely different way. Getting out of that echo chamber, getting off of Twitter and Facebook, and just going and experiencing with people what they are experiencing, and realizing that they're catching maybe 1 in every 10 words that the Pope is actually saying, and they're still having a remarkable experience of it. It's always good to remember. Who's next? I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, to all of you, thank you so much. Professor Ivereigh, also Professor Thavis. On key number 1, within the tradition of Yves Congar and within the Catholic tradition. The Pope Francis remains as Pope, as a leader for all of us Catholic. Last year in October, about the beginning of the Synod for the Family, there was a book that was released by some cardinals calling to reaffirm the traditional values on the family. And that was a sort of created like a source of controversy around the Catholic world, because it was kind of like indirectly like making some sort of giving some sort of awareness, like if Pope Francis was leading us on a different track, you know. Even though if maybe that was not the intention of the authors, but the attempt of the book kind of. Then recently there's been some issues. There was a letter that is going on signed by some U.S. priests inviting, like at the beginning of this, the approaching of this new synod of the family, inviting everybody to kind of a call to keeping the traditional values on the family and marriage. Since we all know that Pope Francis is never going to lead us on our own way when it comes to our Catholic identity and the marriage and the family, can you give us some light that can maybe help us to understand what's the direction, the pastoral direction that Pope Francis is willing us to be on this issue? Thank you so much.
No, thanks very much. I was around as these guys were at the beginning of the synod last year, and it was extraordinary how the idea had come about that the Pope was in some way calling into question the doctrine, the disciplinary practice of the sacraments, which is, as you know, that people who are in irregular relationships can't receive the sacraments. At no point was this ever in question, but what happened was that certain people became convinced that Cardinal Kasper, who said that we should look at the orthodox solution to this, the idea took root that the Pope was seeking in some way to bring about what Kasper was saying should be looked at. And therefore these cardinals reacted in this way by presenting a whole series of essays explaining why that doctrine and that practice existed. I think from Francis's point of view, you know, it was, he was amazed that they did it. Why did they feel the need to produce essays reaffirming what everybody already knew? So I think from the very beginning there was a misunderstanding among some people, which of course crept into the media very quickly, about what the synod was about. The way I explain the synod, and I've had this explained to me by people who are close to Francis, is this. Let me just try and put it as very simply. As you know, in this country, we'll just take the United States, there's been a massive decline in the number of Catholics getting married sacramentally in the church. And there has been a very large increase in the numbers divorcing. It's about 30% of Catholics, I believe, in this country have divorced. Now, of those, very few will seek an annulment. Many more in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Of every 2 annulments given by the church, 1 is in the United States. So the US is, if you like, the annulment capital of the church, if I can put it that way. And yet even here, the proportion of those who look to annulity is tiny. What does this mean? This means that as society has... The church has traditionally relied on society, culture rather, to tell people roughly what marriage is. The church has always assumed that people going into marriage have a rough idea what it is, right? Because they assume that culture has had that knowledge. But actually that hasn't been true for a very long time. So very large numbers of Catholics have been marrying with the mental horizon of the culture rather than being properly catechized. The consequences of that are huge numbers of Catholics who no longer go to church and receive the sacraments and have become alienated from parish life. Now, everybody agrees that the church needs a massive mobilization of resources and thinking in order better to prepare people for marriage and to support people who are married. But for Francis, that's not enough. We also have to take care of, we have to focus on all those hundreds of thousands, indeed millions worldwide, of people who have become alienated from the church. So what he wants is for the synod to explore ways in which they can be encouraged to come back to the church. Now, and that then implies a whole series of changes and reforms, which we can discuss at length, reforms to the annulment system to make them more accessible, internal forum solutions possibly. I know bishops want to be able to give the right for some couples or some people to receive the sacraments under certain very specific conditions. Whatever the synod comes up with, it's very hard to tell at the moment, but the point of the synod is to make it possible to open up the spaces to allow people to come back to parish life. That is the purpose of the synod. And Francis has given the message to people that they should not feel that they are no longer Catholics because they are in irregular situations. It's about the church taking responsibility for what has already happened, as well as preparing people for marriage in the future. That's what I mean by a change of focus.
Right, I can't add too much to what Austen just said, but just a couple of things. The publication of that book on the eve of the Synod and the debate that then ensued at the Synod was, my point of view, remarkable. I had never really seen anything like that at the Vatican in 30 years of covering the place, because there were open divisions. There were open divisions about how far the church should go in practicing this call for mercy. You know, mercy, yes, but we remind the sinner of what is the sin. We defend marriage. We do this and that. And there's, I think a lot of the people at the old guard at the Vatican were certainly willing to accommodate a new style in Pope Francis when it came to things like what he was wearing and the cars he was driving in, but not when it touched on specific church teachings. And here was the ground that they were going to take a stand. And as I say, it was remarkable because it was out in the open. I do think this is a debate that has simmered kind of below the surface for many, many years. It's a debate about how we want to be merciful, but how far can we go? And I just want to read one very briefly, a story which may be news to some of you. In a new set of guidelines for confessors, the Vatican said that while birth control is always morally wrong, it should generally be forgiven in confession, even for penitents who may habitually return to the practice. Quote from this document, especially in these times, the Church considers it to be one of her principal duties to proclaim the mystery of mercy. Okay. That document was released in 1997. So again, you know, this aspect of mercy, we show mercy to people, how far do we go? It's a debate that's been going on for years and years inside the Vatican and elsewhere.
That wrap it up? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry we're out of time. I know a lot of you have questions. These guys are going to be around, Austen Ivereigh, John Thavis, they'll be around. I'm sure we'll be happy to speak with you over the course of the afternoon. Terrific. A round of applause, please, for Austen Ivereigh, John Thavis. Thank you all so much.